Today's lecture deals with the First World War. It was known to its contemporaries who couldn't yet imagine, as horrors unfolded before them, that it would be the First World War. They called it instead the Great War. They could little anticipate that this would be but the first in a succession of such world conflicts. In our previous lecture, we had discussed omens of conflict at the end of the 19th century, certain dark signs that conflict had certainly not been abolished from human affairs, and that indeed some looked to conflict for hopes of progress. In today's lecture, we'll examine how those premonitions were met and surpassed in practice in World War I. The war was unleashed, in fact, by an act of terrorism that came in the summer of 1914, which many contemporaries remember as sort of a long summer of beautiful weather, but that was but the prelude to coming horrors. The advent of this war had many causes, and indeed historians still continue to argue about the precise causes of the First World War, but these included the readiness, fundamentally, of Europe's great powers to go to war, and in part that certain mindset that we had discussed when we considered omens of conflict, the conviction that some great war was in the offing sooner or later, and if it were to come, inevitably, then perhaps better sooner than later. The First World War really marks, in a very important way, our modern experience. It launched the 20th century on its violent course. The First World War had important consequences for the world in the century to come because of the massive brutalization it brought. Though it's difficult to quantify precisely, it's clear that some respect for the status of human life and the human individual was cruelly shattered in the experiences of the First World War. Historians have struggled for ways to describe what they see as the truly epochal significance of this 4 years of carnage from 1914 to 1918 that then had its reverberations through the 20th century. The American diplomat and historian George Kennan called it the seminal catastrophe of the 20th century, the original catastrophe that launched the 20th century on its violent course. And this has been, in the eyes of many historians, so very apt a phrase that they have borrowed Kennan's words and indeed have been using them in translation in other languages as well. The First World War would see from 1914 many dreadful firsts. The first use of poison gas, the first mass bombing from the air of civilian centers, the first genocide, that is to say, the first mass killing of people in the context of a war, not for anything they'd done or proposed to do, but because of who they were, the attempted annihilation of an ethnic group. Many of the horrors yet to unfold in the 20th century clearly had their origins here, in these 4 years, and in the dynamics that they produced. The coming of this conflict, in spite of the mindset of those who had felt premonitions in the years previous, was not inevitable, but it certainly was made all the more likely by misapprehensions, mutual fears, and instability that was abroad in European society at the start of the 20th century. And within the European continent, there was in particular one spot where this instability was especially strong, and that was in an area of the world that still continues to be a troubled spot today, in the Balkan Peninsula. This was an especially dangerous and friction-filled place at the start of the 20th century because so much was changing there in political terms. The great Ottoman Turkish Empire, which was perceived as being on decline and often called the sick man of Europe because of what was understood to be its inability to hitch its train to the great onward advance of progress, was increasingly being pushed out of the Balkan Peninsula by Balkan peoples. Now, certainly there had been attempts at reform in the Ottoman Empire, the so-called Young Turk movement, and we still today, in fact, call radicals and fiery individuals Young Turks in recognition of this earlier model. The Young Turk movement had sought to reform the empire and to modernize it on coming to power in 1908 in Turkey. But in spite of these attempts at reform, Turkey had nonetheless suffered tremendous losses and reverses in the Balkan Wars of 1912 and 1913, wars of such a ferocity that some historians consider them a dress rehearsal for the atrocities of the First World War. After the increasingly successful rolling back of the Ottoman Turkish Empire from the Balkans, Serbian nationalists, members of a proud, self-liberating nation, turned their attention to the other empire of the region, which they saw as the great oppressor of their Serbian people, which they longed to unite. This other empire was Austria-Hungary, which also ruled over minority Serb populations. It was the aim of Serbian nationalists to unite Serbian populations wherever they lived into one greater Serbia. An ideology, thus, of Serbian nationalism holding up that dream of the greater Serbia, the unified Serbian people, was a powerful and enchanting vision for many Serbian nationalists. And there was, moreover, a terrorist organization which was known by the popular name of the Black Hand, whose goal it was to make this goal come to pass. The Black Hand terrorist organization was known officially by its name Union or Death. It was not a large group. It had, at a expansive estimate, perhaps some 2,000 members, but some of those members had held influential positions in Serbian society within the Kingdom of Serbia itself, as well as in minority populations elsewhere. It also had as its members officers of the Serb army. It was a classic secret organization. It had rituals, it had mysterious ceremonies, it had significant oaths, and it had a commitment to action. Its own bylaws stated that terrorist action, the propaganda of the deed that we had discussed in an earlier lecture, was better than propaganda of the intellect or the mind. In the oaths of the Union or Death organization, prospective members had to give absolute obedience as their pledge. They willingly had to give up their personalities, their hopes of personal glory, their deeds, important as they might never be known. They could never leave this organization once they had joined. A central committee in Belgrade would hand out death sentences and order actions, all towards the goal of union or death. The flag, which was the symbol of this society, showed its ideas in symbolic form. There was the seal showing a strong arm holding a flag, and on that flag, a skull and crossbones was a prominent symbol. Surrounding it were the tools of insurrection and terrorism, a knife, a bomb, a bottle of poison, and surrounding this, the words, the pledge of the organization, union or death. This organization struck in that summer of 1914, hoping to unleash a conflict which would lead to the realization of their dreams. A conflict is certainly what they unleashed. On June 28, 1914, members of this secret society had planned an assassination in the dusty provincial capital of Sarajevo in the south of Austria-Hungary. There, they assassinated, in a not very well-planned attempt, assassinated the Archduke Francis Ferdinand, heir to the throne of the Habsburg Empire. This was a blow to be struck for the freedom and unity of Serbia, but it precipitated events that soon went far out of the control of their initiators. Austria-Hungary was urged on by its ally, the German Empire, to choreograph carefully in diplomatic terms a showdown, using this event, tragic as it was, as a pretext for a settling of scores with the small kingdom of Serbia. It was feared that if scores were not settled now, if this crisis was not used in order to clear the air diplomatically and to show Serbia its place, that the Slavic minorities of the Austro-Hungarian Empire might lose their faith in the dynastic stability of the Habsburg family. And thus, Austria-Hungary was pressed by its German ally to carefully craft an ultimatum that would be unacceptable to the Serbian kingdom in spite of its attempts to meet all reasonable demands. To have met all of the terms of the ultimatum would have meant nothing less than giving up national independence. It was pre-programmed to lead to conflict. But what began as a very carefully crafted and localized conflict soon spread until it had acquired a European reach, because alliances between the different European great powers now ominously clicked into place. Serbia, being threatened by Austria-Hungary, brought in the great Slavic big brother of the Serbians, the Russian Empire in the east. The Russian Empire's activation of its diplomatic and military resources in turn encouraged Austria-Hungary's Germanic big brother to intervene. Imperial Germany now declared itself interested in this conflict, as alliances now were coming into effect. As Germany faced the anxiety of the great nightmare of German politicians coming true, of war on two fronts potentially, both against the Russian Empire as well as against France, Germany preemptively began to move against the French Republic. Even voices urging peace were now drowned out by the urgent imperatives of military plans for mobilization. Mass armies had to be put on the move and rush towards the frontiers. Timetables of railroad movements planned down to the minute had to be kept to. Plans for peace could gain no purchase. Now, the popular reaction on the part of the masses or crowds of Europe really form a significant and in many ways riveting story in the psychological history of modern societies. In August of 1914, in that long, beautiful summer, the news of war, the realization of those omens of conflict that we discussed in an earlier lecture, were met in European capitals not by crowds of quiet, ashen-faced individuals crying or worried about what this war might hold, but rather crowds that celebrated, that were whipped up into waves of enthusiasm. In the capitals of Europe, in London, in Paris, in Berlin, in St. Petersburg, crowds gathered to cheer, to wave flags, to sing national anthems, to greet young men who were rushing off to recruiting stations, and to praise God that war had arrived at last. In some sense, this reaction, so foreign to our own, had much perhaps to do with a sense of a long-lasting fear of war that had preceded 1914. This tension had finally broken and perhaps contributed to this odd symptom of mass hysteria, which historians have since called the August madness of 1914. Now, historians have been careful, especially in the last years, to point out and modify the popular vision of the August madness by emphasizing that this enthusiasm was not universal. Clearly, it did not monolithically sweep up everybody in all European societies to cheer for war. At the same time, however, the evidence of photographs and contemporaries remains and has an element of truth to it. The spontaneous mobilization of the combatant countries was great. Many contemporaries would later recall this as one of the most sublime moments of their lives, a moment when the divisions in society had been overcome, when crowds were no longer divided into classes, but rather French stood united with French, Germans with Germans, Russians with Russians, and British with British. Even that analyst of crowd psychology, Canetti, had pointed out that the crowds of 1914 in some sense represented a new phenomenon of mass mobilization. From now on, wars would be mass wars, he argued. The enthusiasm for this new conflict was also reflected not only in the spontaneous celebrations of the streets in European capitals in August, but also in a remarkable spontaneous propaganda. Governments, in some sense, didn't even have to organize an outpouring of patriotic enthusiasm in 1914. Ordinary members of the societies in Europe would very willingly do so on their own. It's emphasized, for instance, that in the first months of 1914, German newspapers were flooded by 1 million patriotic poems pledging Germany's commitment to the struggle. I might mention among those 1 million poems some of truly incredibly horrid quality. Nonetheless, this evidence of popularity and enthusiasm was not feigned. And in part, one could see the effectiveness, the surprise of this moment of exaltation in the way in which certain expectations had not been realized. One of the most important of these expectations had to do with the insistence of socialist movements following Marx's ideas in the years before the outbreak of the First World War that workers who had loyalty to their class and not to their nation, which Marx had dismissed as being a fraud perpetrated by the ruling classes upon workers to make them unaware of their real, actual class interests, that socialist parties had pledged themselves in the years before 1914 that if the capitalists should ever try to take the working class into a war for their capitalistic economic purposes, the socialist movements would simply, in a mass of international solidarity, shut down the war. They would do so by refusing to serve. They would engage in a general strike that would shut down the economies of those countries proposing to go to war. And the result would be not the unleashing of a capitalist war in Europe, but rather, instead, the precipitation of that final workers' revolution. Well, in 1914, contrary to the worst fears of conservative elites, contrary to all those rhetorical, radical promises of the years previous to the war, socialist parties did no such thing. In one European country after another, the socialists voted for war credits, supported war efforts of their respective homelands, rather than refusing to participate as they earlier had vowed to do. It's been said that in that moment of the declaration of war, German workers and French workers had discovered that they might very well have had much in common with one another as workers, but that in 1914 they had discovered that they were first of all Frenchmen, first of all Germans, and they patriotically flocked to their national cause. Radical socialists like Vladimir Ilyich Lenin, in exile in Switzerland, who held much more firmly to the program of international revolution, were disgusted beyond words at what they saw as the collapse, the moral failure of international socialist solidarity. And they would await the correct moment to take action in this context. As young men flocked by the millions to recruiting stations or were called up for arms, many of them had the expectation of a brief war marked by heroism, chivalry, adventure, and they enlisted en masse. Mass armies of crowded soldiers would march into battle, would be hurried towards the frontiers to strike the decisive blow in the First World War. The reality, however, that awaited them, the world of the trenches and trench warfare on the Western Front, would be entirely different from their expectations. The plans which generals had hatched for swift victories, foremost among them the secret Schlieffen Plan of German military planners, failed very quickly, and instead of the expectations of quick victory, mobility, glorious cavalry charges, one instead saw a far grimmer scene. Both sides stood their ground and began to dig in. They dug in along trenches, preparing for a long, drawn-out war. The Western Front, two opposing lines of trenches with a no-man's land in between, would run from the Swiss Alps for about 500 miles all the way to the British Channel. And it would create a landscape such as only the most fevered nightmares of former artists could have imagined. Trench warfare remade that landscape into a landscape of mud, barbed wire, and the surreal no man's land that lay between the fortifications of either side. An area littered by corpses, by barbed wire, by shed armaments, and, so the myths that circulated among soldiers stated, by giant rats such as mankind had never seen before, bred by this conflict. The battlefields were ones in which personal heroism seemed to mean almost nothing. They were dominated not by heroic men, but rather by heavy artillery, machine guns that could mow down literally hundreds of soldiers, even in the hands of an incompetent marksman who simply had to take the machine gun. The very name is significant because of its ability to produce mass death. Even an incompetent marksman would simply have to tap the barrel of a machine gun slowly to move it across a killing field of fire to obliterate even the most heroic and determined patriotic frontal attacks of the kind that generals lacking imagination mounted with ever-growing scale on the Western Front. As a culminating horror came another new technology, poison gas, a horrific addition to the arsenals of modernity. Soldiers themselves had a keener understanding of what was happening to them than the generals behind the lines. Soldiers, in their accounts, in their letters home, in their memoirs afterwards, if they were lucky enough to survive, recorded their feelings of growing increasingly anonymous. Individual heroism seemed obsolete in modern industrial war. And there was above all one symbolic representation for this trend, the anonymity, the replaceability of an ordinary human being. It was the replacement of those glorious plumed hats and bright uniforms of the 19th century with the darker, more camouflaged colors of the uniforms of the First World War, and especially the stark metal helmets that made all soldiers look alike, anonymous laborers on the battlefield of war. The soldiers also were increasingly unknown in another sense. The unknown soldier, the victim of the First World War, whose body could never be recovered, became a ubiquitous symbol for the horrors of this conflict and their toll. It's estimated in a horrific statistic that nearly half of all the bodies of the dead in the war were never recovered or identified, but instead were ground down into insignificance or lost in the mud of Flanders. There was one particular battle, however, that even among such surpassing horrors went beyond all of this to become the symbol of industrial conflict. This was the Battle of Verdun in 1916. And this hallowed ground remains significant in European popular memory to this very day. It was the site of a titanic battle between the Germans and the French, which illustrated best of all the futility and destructive power of this war. This was a lesson that was repeated, as it were, by the British at the Somme soon afterwards, just to prove that they hadn't learned the lesson of Verdun. The German plans quite deliberately set out to stage a battle at a symbolically important spot, the fortress of Verdun, which was important to the French, which they could not give up, which they would be forced to commit reserves to. The aim of the German plans was to bleed the French army white, as the general made clear. They would succeed in this task, but in the process they would bleed their own army white as well. On the first day of the Battle of Verdun, on February 21st, 1916, an enormous bombardment was unleashed, such as had never been seen before. 1 million shells were fired, landing on the fortresses of Verdun. The shelling in the next days was so intense that it was said that men went mad, even in safe bunkers, from the impact of that shelling. In 10 months of inconclusive conflict that followed, it's estimated that 750,000 French and German soldiers were killed for the advance of only a few miles. On the Eastern Front, a more mobile and more changeable front, the German army scored successes against the Russians, who were woefully unprepared for this conflict. But even there, definitive victory eluded the Germans, and the experience of that front, including the experience of occupation of vast territories of Eastern Europe in what amounted to a colonial empire close to home, was brutalizing in ways that were different from the war in the West. The psychological toll of this kind of warfare in the trenches, in particular, showed up in a phenomenon that at first military doctors lacked a word for. This was the phenomenon that they at first called shell shock. It was a phenomenon whereby even the most committed, heroic, stalwart soldiers who were motivated and patriotic were worn down by the impact of what they'd seen and what they'd done, what they had experienced. Over time, under the impact of trench warfare, even these most determined soldiers could be worn down in spirit, reduced to tears, reduced to nervous spasms, with the inability to understand or follow orders. We now understand this psychological phenomenon as part of the debilitating effects of this conflict. We now call it post-traumatic stress disorder. As the word shell shock suggests, however, doctors were at first prone to look for a physical explanation for what had happened. They suggested that perhaps the impact of the bursting of a shell jarred the brain of a soldier, even if he was not physically injured or scathed, and thus produced shell shock, which had a nervous effect upon the psychological functioning of a soldier. It took a long time for medical doctors of the First World War to understand that this was a real phenomenon, and it's wrenching to read in the historical record that a number of those soldiers who first were diagnosed with this shell shock phenomenon were suspected of being malingerers or cowards, and who were shot when they in fact were the victims of the experience that they had been sent out to endure in the trenches by their betters. The phenomenon of the First World War was also grueling for another kind of person whose helplessness and subjection behind barbed wire would become, unfortunately, all too typical of people in the 20th century. It's estimated that some 8.5 million soldiers would spend at least part of the war as prisoners of war, behind barbed wire, in camps, living in terrible conditions, not conditions approaching those of the death camps or concentration camps of the Second World War, but nonetheless, their fate, their lingering behind barbed wire, would become an all too common symbol of the 20th century. However, there were other psychological effects beyond the breakdown of shell shock, and they belong in our record of the psychological effects of the First World War. And they include the brutalizing effect of this war upon soldiers called stormtroopers, who didn't break down, but instead started to feel uncannily at home in the trench environment. One part of the psychological consequences of this war was the brutalization of participants in trench warfare. New elite forces, and they existed on all of the fighting sides in the First World War, were called in general stormtroopers, were created to break through the stalemate of the trenches. As stormtroopers, they are intended to blow through the defenses of the opposite side, break through the trenches, and once again bring about a decisive victory. The Italian elite fighters were known by the characteristically beautiful name of Arditi, the bold ones, the ones who had no fear, and they were proud of this name. The German units were called, perhaps a little more romantically still, Sturmtruppen, or stormtroopers. One of them, Ernst Jünger, recorded the spirit of these units in his very disturbing memoir, The Storm of Steel. He announced that here he and his fellows had experienced a new model of heroism. They were princes of the trenches who loved raids, taking prisoners, risking their lives on a daily basis. Such units were indeed celebrated as a new breed of young heroes. But a question presented itself to contemporaries as it presents itself to us. Such young men, who were members of stormtrooper units, who had never known a civilian existence but had come of age in the trenches, would they find it easy to adjust to peacetime? Would they be able to demobilize psychologically to a normalcy they'd never known as adults? The answer was clearly no. The brutalizing effects, the increase of violence in such radical form that trench warfare represented, would continue in reverberations in Western civilization afterwards. Total war was the name given to this comprehensive phenomenon. It was a term coined to sum up the all-encompassing nature of modern industrial war, which saw not only armies fighting armies, but societies fighting societies, nations mobilized against nations. This conflict seemed to be of a kind that demanded the total mobilization of mass armies, economies, societies, and the hearts and minds of people in the countries at war. The stakes of this war were total as well. Total victory or total sheer defeat would be the outcome, not a reasoned compromise not after such sacrifices, not after such hatred, not after such bloodletting. The winner would be paradoxically not an outright winner, but the last one standing after the long, drawn-out process of attrition. The total war had finally two crucial implications that would haunt Western civilization and indeed the world through the 20th century. Because civilians were crucial to working for a country's victory and total mobilization, civilians would increasingly be seen as legitimate targets of violence as well, however lamentable this might seem in moral terms. Civilians would become targets in total war. The strains of total war would also tear at societies. A gap could grow up between soldiers in the trenches and the civilians who had not experienced what they had experienced on the home front. Social tension could lead to the search for scapegoats for such suffering in one's own midst. Total war was a process that once begun would continue, and we'll discuss it in our next lecture on the process of sliding into total war.